Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Jim Zub. He's a writer for, well, a lot of different companies, but Marvel Comics in particular. Jim, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now, on your website, you have a tutorial of sort of the way to get into comics. And I was wondering if you could tell us how you got the attention of Marvel, which is the #1 publisher.
Sure. The tutorial thing is kind of interesting. It wasn't my intent to kind of be so. I do teach actually at an art college here in Toronto. I'm a Canadian, so I live up in the Great White North. And the tutorial stuff sort of came up a little bit just through conversations that I had with people. A lot of people are curious about how comics work, how to get into the industry and things like that. Any creative industry that you want to work in, you need to create professional quality work that's on the same level as those companies. In this case, we're talking about Marvel Comics, right? So if you want to write for Marvel, you have to be creating comic book stories that grab their attention, that are on the same kind of level being published in the industry. And that might be, there was a time when you had to kind of go through a real kind of strict process, or you had to live in New York City and have access to the office or get recommended by someone already at the company. But nowadays, there's so many more outlets for presenting your work, whether that's online or through a smaller publisher or, independently, just doing it yourself, self-publishing and showing work at a convention. The comics have become a real global kind of industry. And so there are artists who break in from all over the world, showing their samples, putting their artwork up online. And the same kind of thing holds true with writing, collaborating with other people, putting together comic book stories, and not just copying what you see in books being published by Marvel, but really helping kind of push the envelope in terms of different sort of stories, or just the quality of work that speaks to them in terms of action or adventure or emotional content. That's really the basis of it, having a portfolio of work that stands side by side with the work that's being put out by, the publishers that make the industry run.
So from what I took from what you were writing and from what I've heard from other creators, you shouldn't expect to go to the major leagues right away. You should expect to sort of practice in the minors a little bit, whether it's through a smaller publisher like Valiant or Oni or something like that, or as you were saying, publish your own books. And then you can hope to get their attention.
Yeah, the reality, though, is that although I love working for Marvel, I've done work for DC, pretty much every major comic publisher in North America, there are more opportunities for doing your own work and releasing it independently, or owning and controlling your work through a creator-owned publisher like Image, than at any other point in kind of comic publishing history. And that those are also viable paths, that you don't necessarily, that Marvel doesn't have to necessarily be the end game. It might be, and obviously I'm a huge superhero fan and so many other people are all over the place, but that's not the only avenue for success or the only avenue for storytelling in the comic book medium. I think it's a bit of a misnomer when they talk about, they say, mainstream publishers, and they usually mean Marvel and DC, sometimes Image as well, and then they talk about the independents. But the reality is it's not as clear cut as all that. There are comics online that have audiences that are bigger than most superhero titles. There are people that, are releasing their work through platforms like Kickstarter that are able to support themselves better than some people I know freelancing, for the big two. And so it's really about building an audience and having a strong, body of work, more so than necessarily saying, okay, if I don't get a chance to write Wolverine, then I'm not in the comic industry or something.
Now, you talked about Kickstarter. I was wondering if you had any experience with, trying to rally your fan base to support you financially on a project that, in some cases, let's face it, some Kickstarters don't come to fruition. They sort of wither on the vine. So how do you, if you were doing something like that, how would you be able to rally your fan base to support you so that you can then publish a book either through another publisher or through your own imprint?
Right. So I haven't run a Kickstarter myself. I've currently got a Patreon that I run. So The articles that I started posting on my website about things like how to break into comics, how to put together a pitch for a publisher, how to script your stories in a professional manner and communicate with a publisher in terms of ideas, that stuff really built up a nice bit of steam for me. People were interested in finding out how the process worked. And so, I've got an audience now that follows me on Twitter or follows me on Facebook or things like that. And that's going to be your most, that's the immediate audience that you can draw upon whenever you're putting together any kind of fundraiser or any kind of independent sort of, you're asking people on Kickstarter or somewhere else. That's going to be your social media sort of circle is going to be the immediate sort of burst. And what you're hoping for is that other influential people who you are in contact with are going to signal boost that they're going to put it out to a wider audience, that people are going to discover your work and at the same time, hopefully, gravitate towards the idea of possibly supporting your project. That being said, you've got to be realistic about what you can do. If you have 200 followers on Twitter right now and you're banging the drum like crazy, you're not going to get 200 people necessarily right off the bat that are going to, put money up to support you. That's not necessarily how this stuff works. And you can't just look at an online audience as monetization. For me, I really enjoy the interaction that I have with readers, that I have with other professionals, that I have with artists discovering their work. And so the social media stuff is the ability to potentially have people give me some money every month on Patreon to see my comic scripts is a byproduct of it. It's not like you can't just endlessly beat the drum. Your social media channels can't be a relentless promotion machine without anything else, that you're giving people or that they don't see any other aspect of your life. There's sort of a push and pull there nowadays with a creative career where you want to talk about the work, but that can't be everything you are 24/7 online, or it just becomes really kind of a hollow self-promotion thing.
Now, you talked on I think it was on one of your social media platforms about a series that you had just recently pitched to Marvel, and I don't know if I can say what that was or not. But when you have an idea and you want to pitch it to Marvel, what sort of steps do you have to go through before you sit down with an editor to maybe get them to resurrect a series or maybe give you a new book?
Well, it's difficult. Obviously, if you've never done work with them before, it's that much more difficult because you're trying to bridge that gap and convince them that you're someone trustworthy and capable of delivering on what you say you're going to do, and that there's an audience that wants to read it. Once you've established yourself at a publisher, it gets easier, assuming it goes well, assuming that you do a good job. It gets easier, to subsequent projects and subsequent ideas. Like if you see a filmmaker like Tim Burton, he's constantly got Johnny Depp starring in a lot of his movies because they build up a working relationship and they like working with each other. The same thing holds true with editors and writers and artists. You build up the people around you, that your little circle of creators that you trust, or an editor that knows you and likes the way that you do things. And so it gets easier. I worked with Tom Brevoort and Alana Smith on Thunderbolts last year, and we had a great time. And so last year around this time, they contacted me and they said, Jerry Duggan is going to be finishing up his run on Uncanny Avengers. Are you interested in picking up the torch on that? And so I said I did. I read over the series, made sure I understood where it was at, and then proposed where the story could continue and how we would sort of, move the series forward with the characters, what their story would be, who we would add to the cast, how we would change things up while still, keeping in mind what Jerry was doing on the series, that we're not just ditching everything on it. So in that case, I'm continuing something that's already there. If I wanted to pitch a brand new project, I've got to kind of get that through the filter. Marvel is broken up into kind of departments. So you've got the Avengers office and you've got the X-Men office and the Spider-Man office and things like that. And so, there's no point in me pitching a Spider-Man project to Tom Brevoort, the Avengers editor. He's not the one that's running that department. So in that case, I've got to go to someone like Nick Lowe, who works with the Spider-Man crew, and say, hey, I have interest in this particular character or project that's related to what you do. is there an opportunity there to pitch an idea? In some cases, it's just shut down right there, and they say, no, we're not looking for pitches for that thing or whatever. In other cases, they might say, okay, well, what are you thinking? Send me a proposal, and then you back and forth. And like any other kind of, it's like a negotiation. You're figuring out what you want to do. It's not that different from pitching an independent project to a publisher, except you're coming up with a whole cloth where you say, I have a concept. It's a fantasy story or sci-fi or horror or whatever, and I want to bring this to you. It's going to be this format. I'm looking at this kind of possibility. In many cases, you're bringing an artist with the pitch, and you're saying, we want to do this. Do you think that is there interest from this publisher? Can you see this fitting in with your line? And if so, where maybe on the schedule could we put it? How much is our budget, and so on and so forth. So it's all the same kind of stuff. It's just with Marvel, you're dealing with those set characters of the Marvel universe, as opposed to coming up with a whole cloth story.
So you talk about the set characters, and if you have a new approach for, let's say, Wolverine or Rogue,
Right.
Their personalities have sort of been established. And I've been told before by other writers that when you finish your run on a book, you've got to return the characters sort of the same way you got it, with that new character smell. So when you've got an idea, how do you work in your changes to what has to be, Marvel's property?
Sure. I mean, that's one of those difficult things where you want to put part of yourself into a project. You want to write something that you care about, or an idea, a character evolution that you feel strongly about. And at the same time, you are playing in a shared sandbox. So the bigger the change, the more people have to approve it, or the more difficult it's going to be to sort of go through those filters. But if you believe in it strongly enough, one of the best conversations I've ever had with an editor was with Tom Brevoort, my editor on the Avengers. And he said to me, if you believe in something passionately, pitch it to me. And if I say, no, like you've got to back it up. Like, imagine this is a legal case, and you've got to, get your evidence together, and you got to come to the judge and say, I believe that this is the way, this should be, or this is how the event should go. And he's like, I can make a pretty good case, because that's my job as, the editor of the Avengers. I've been doing this for a long time. You have to convince me. But if you can convince me, then I will carry it up the ladder, and I will help champion it for you. And if you believe in it, then tell me why. Make me believe in it the way that you do, this particular story evolution, this particular character change. So in the case of Uncanny Avengers, which is the series I'm writing right now, we were talking about character relationships, which characters might get together, and that's a pretty big change to a character. These people falling in love, these people having a relationship. And some of that's going to carry on, potentially after I finish writing the series, those feelings that those characters have for each other. So justifying that and really giving it its due, making it feel like it's natural, and having it be something that I believe in, that the editors believe in, that the artist is excited about, and then, of course, the readers are as well, is part of my case. Like, I have to say, this is why I think these characters are compatible. They've known each other, but this is what's going to change to really bring them and kind of go, oh, I never saw you that way, or wait, I have feelings for you in a whole other aspect. And that's, it's exciting stuff to be able to put down little pieces in the Marvel Universe to build little areas. And you don't know if it's going to last, and you don't know if the next writer is going to necessarily carry it forward or not, but that's part and parcel of a shared fictional universe like this. So you've got to kind of be confident in what you're doing and be able to bring that forward. All of this is communication. Storytelling is communication, art is communication, and the pitch, convincing your publisher and editors that your ideas are worthy is part of that communication. I can't just say I want to do it. I've got to justify why.
It's interesting, you talk about justifying it. A lot of young writers, a lot of young artists have this great idea. I'm going to pitch this story to Marvel, and in it everybody dies except for this new hero that I create. I don't think Marvel is going to go for that, first off. But if you were to take a story like that and make it your own on your own website or something, that might be a way to, I guess, maybe get your foot in the door eventually towards Marvel, because they would see the type of story.
What I recommend you do is don't do fan fiction-y kind of stuff where you're just writing about established characters. Create your own stories. because first of all, you don't want to tangle with any of the copyright stuff, or the last thing you want is Marvel's first impression of you to be, oh, this person thinks they can write whatever they want about our characters. If you write a really good, gripping thriller story or espionage story, then maybe, someone at Marvel goes, oh man, I can't get enough of this guy's spy stuff. We've got spy characters, Shield, Nick Fury, and Winter Soldier, and all this stuff. They'd be a really good fit for that. Or maybe they really like military stuff. Maybe the Punisher would be a really good fit for them. So then you're adjacent to the stuff that they're doing, and you're showing that you have a broad you've got skills, but you're not necessarily just pinning all your hopes and dreams on, I need to write this one particular Marvel character. I think it's a much healthier way to sort of build up your work. And I think it's also a more mature sort of way to build up your repertoire, that you've got your own stories, you've got your own ideas, and you can bring something to the table for an established property. So I've done a lot of different license work. I currently do the Dungeons and Dragons series. And the way I got Dungeons and Dragons was because I've done a bunch of other fantasy books. So I did a series called Skull Kickers, which was more comedy. It's an action comedy, sword and sorcery. And it's clearly a love letter to Dungeons and Dragons, but it's not one-to-one. Like, it's still its own thing. And people read it and they go, oh man, I can tell you really love D&D, but it wasn't, copyright breaching crazy. And it still stood on its own merits as a fantasy story, whether or not you've ever, rolled a 20-sided die or something. But when the people at Dungeons and Dragons read it, they were like, this guy loves the game. He clearly really digs this stuff. And the story's really fun and we really like it. Why don't we get him in here to do some Dungeons and Dragons work? And that's how that kind of stuff comes about, One of the things I'll say to people is that if they're like, I'd love to do a superhero book or a team book or something like that, say, okay, what kind of stories do you gravitate to? Whether it's action and adventure or, supernatural stuff, put that stuff into your stories. But don't necessarily just do a Wolverine character. Do your own kind of thing. Build your own kind of stuff. People had me kind of pegged as the sword and sorcery guy for a couple years, and I loved it. I love writing those kinds of stories, but I wanted to branch out, and so I did an Image series called Wayward, which is about teenagers, and it's this ensemble cast, and it takes place in Japan, so we've got some exotic locales and mythology on the other side of the world, and people really dug it, and they go, oh, Jim can write, teenage characters. Oh, he can write team books and stuff like that. So it kind of opened up the possibilities without me just saying, like, I'm writing a poor man's version of the X-Men or something,
Now, it's interesting, again, when we talk about young writers, we often hear about the event that's going to happen and not the character that's going to be impacted by the event and how that event is going to make this character grow and become a better, stronger person by the end of the story.
Right.
So if I'm a young writer, how do you impart to me the importance of character?
I think really, the stuff that you're talking about, the major events that Marvel do, no starting writer is going to be able to architect those major events. That's something that comes with experience and it comes with trust. So you've got to focus on character first and foremost, because that's going to build up that trust. When I started writing Thunderbolts, the first thing I did is I put together a little character matrix, who these characters are, how they relate to each other at the start of the story, and how they're going to evolve and relate to each other by the end of the story, and then figuring out what events will transpire to make those changes happen that feel logical and feel emotionally satisfying along the way. That the characters are moving incrementally forward, but that you still know who they are overall. You know what I mean? And so character is what we obsess over. The reason why we love stories is because of these characters, because of the changes they go through. We don't just, like, Star Wars is a bunch of space battles and lightsabers, but it's also people, it's characters, it's Luke Skywalker and it's Han Solo and it's Princess Leia and Obi-Wan Kenobi and all these characters. That's what really sticks with us, is that emotional core of those characters and their story. If that stuff's not functioning, then people aren't going to remember it, and you see that even in blockbuster movies. They can have a big opening, but what's the long tail and rewatchability on just a special effects kind of mess versus a deeper and more, satisfying character story?
It's funny because when you mention Star Wars, you can think of a dozen movies that follow the same basic formula. It's if you look at a Justice League story that Giffen and DeMatteis were working on, you can have the same events, but because they are writing Guy Gardner a certain way, you're going to have
Right.
A completely different feel for them defeating the bad guy.
Yeah, and sometimes one of the things that I know some writers will do is you watch TV or you watch other dramas and things like that, and you go, oh, I would have done it differently. And so you kind of file the serial numbers off and you go, well, I'm not doing an episode of ER, but I can take some of those thematic ideas, or I can take some of those moral quandaries and put them into a superhero context, or put them into a horror context, or whatever. That you find storytelling pretty much anywhere, or you meet people all the time. One of the things I tell my students is that if you get a chance to travel, if you get a chance to see the world and to engage in other cultures, other people, open yourself up to other people's stories and you'll be a better storyteller. Don't just talk, listen to other people's experiences, listen to the things that they do, listen to the emotional content in their lives, and you will become a broader, better storyteller. And so when I travel, when I meet people, when I interact with them, little bits and pieces kind of stick with me, and I think about that and I go, oh, this person, I'm not putting them directly in my story, but some little bit sticks with me and ends up working its way in there, whether it's the way they speak or a particular little thing they told me or an anecdote. You find storytelling and it kind of comes from anywhere.
And it is funny because you meet people every day and there's just that one little piece that will color some part of your work, whether it's like you said, just a crazy accent or one of those wacky stories about a guy using a wrench to fix a light bulb or something.
Right.
Just changing gears a little bit, you have a full-time job, and you are a full-time writer. So how do you find the discipline to sit down at the keyboard, to come up with a story month after month, hit that deadline, and still have time to go to your other job, help out all your students? I assume you have friends and family that you like to spend time with. So how do you balance all of that out and at the end of the day still hit that deadline?
Well, my wife's very patient. So first and foremost, you got to have the people. Your support network is really important. So, at first, I think it was particularly difficult. This is going to sound weird. It actually is getting easier now because the profile of the projects I'm doing is larger. It's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to lock myself in my studio and work for 3 hours on something that might never come out. It's another thing to say, hey, I need a couple hours to work on the Avengers. Like people are like, oh, okay, I know what that is. I'm excited about that. I want to, you're making progress. You're doing something. So it's weirdly gotten easier over time. But it is about a bit of a discipline in that regard. Some people I know are intuitive writers, and they kind of write by the seat of their pants. They put down they generate a ton of material, and then they edit a ton, and they rewrite a ton, and they slowly but surely kind of forge it into something. I don't know if it's because my background's in animation, but I don't work that way. I'm very much a structure junkie. And so I do a lot of the heavy lifting at the start. The planning process is really crucial to me. So I hammer out a lot of those parts at the beginning of the process. So by the time I'm scripting, I already know thematically where we're going. I know how many pages this scene is going to be. I know what the end result of this scene is going to be. And now I just need to make it snappy and make the dialogue work and so on. So I plan out big swaths of story in advance. I do it in a pretty methodical manner, and still trying to allow myself room to, you have spontaneous ideas. You have great little happy accidents that you go, oh man, this is even better. This ties together more than I thought, or things like that. But the overarching elements of it, how the story is going to work, I really build much more carefully at the beginning, get that approved. So then when I'm on the schedule and I sit down and I go, okay, tonight I've got 3 hours after dinner to write, I know with pretty good accuracy how productive I can be, how much I can put down on the page. And so when I build that schedule and I tell an editor it's coming in this day, I mean it. Like I really do. And that comes from, I think, again, that my background in animation, there's a real discipline there for you've got to be able to crank out artwork. Not every day is going to be an A day, but at the very least, you're going to be putting out B plus work no matter what, delivering the goods. And setting those deadlines and goals and then meeting them and getting that momentum and continuing to carry it forward. You know, when you're the writer on a comic project, you are generating the content that people are going to be drawing and coloring and lettering and editing. Without you, the whole machine stops and the work isn't getting done. So it's not just my career, it's not just my paycheck. I'm stalling 4, 5, maybe 6 other people whose livelihoods depend on that story. And that pressure is a good kind of pressure. That's the kind of responsibility that gets your butt in gear and gets you to sit down and not waste time. Turn off Twitter and Facebook. This is not the time for a video game. This is, you know, I said I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to script 6 pages tonight, or I'm going to script 10 pages, or I'm going to finish this outline. And I got to do it. I got to grind it and make it happen. And that's a discipline that I'm not perfect at it. Obviously, I make mistakes like anyone else, but more often than not, I know my own kind of deliverable. I know my productivity, and I can put it into place. And that's something that I think a lot of creative people don't understand if they haven't worked in a creative industry. They get the idea that creativity is about the muses kissing your fingertips and everything's going to be inspirational. And at the end of the day, you're going to get up you'll be exhausted, but look, it's art and it just pops out of you. There are times when you get that kind of writing rush, when it all feels like it's flowing and you're way more productive than you thought and you lose track of time. But that can't be the only way you create if you want to do this as a job. Like, you have to be able to push yourself even when you're not quite feeling it. You have to be able to break through even when you're struggling a little bit, you know, in front of the keyboard, and know that with practice, the act of doing it will generate at least something that you can work with later.
It's funny, I have a friend who's an author, and he said that no one ever says they get plumber's block, you know, and
Right.
you've got to go and do the work even if you don't feel like it. And I think that's what you're saying, is you've got to work at it. And I'm being waved at right now, which means that we've run out of time. I
No
think I've got
worries.
time for one more quick question. The
Sure.
industry is a lot of writing for the trade, and I'm just wondering, when you're designing a book and you know you've got a double-page spread, how tight do you have to be to make sure that that double-page spread goes in the right spot in the trade?
I plan it out methodically. So I not only do an outline of what's happening in this issue, but once I have that approved, I'll literally do a page breakdown. So I know this scene is going to be 3 pages, and on the page turn, we're going to get this surprise. This is where the double page spread will hit, and it'll be on an odd page or an even page properly so that it fits in the book the way it's supposed to. So I'm pretty anal about that. Like, I want it to read properly. I want to make sure those page turns are working to my advantage. And so it's very important. It's intrinsic to the entire comic reading process.
Well, I'm glad we got that, because they are hollering at me now that we do have to wrap up. Jim
No
Zub,
worries.
thank you so much for joining us on Comic Culture, and thank you at home for watching. We'll see you again soon.